Hi, Nick.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
So far, so good. What about you?
Okay. Well, the conversation is young. Maybe that'll change. I'm doing okay. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter, to which I think everyone should subscribe. And this is a Nonzero podcast that you could also subscribe to. You are Nick Bostrom, very well-known philosopher of a kind of unusual sort. I mean, is there a label for the kind of philosopher you are? Are you called a philosopher of futurism or something?
No label that I really like. I mean, philosopher, I guess, is broad enough to encompass a lot of things that I'm interested in. But
Well, you're definitely a philosopher by credential, but you're an unusual. You're an unusual.
yeah, I've never really made a sharp separation between philosophy and science. And so in my academic background, I studied a bunch of things, theoretical physics and AI and all kinds of stuff. And in my subsequent work as well, it's often kind of pursued its prey across the boundaries of different disciplinary fields.
Okay, so we're going to talk about your new book, Deep Utopia, Life and Meaning in a Solved World. I think we should talk about it in the context of your past work. And also, I want to say a little about that for the benefit of people who may not be familiar with how influential you've been in some circles. I mean, first of all, your name is associated with a couple of pretty well-known arguments or thought experiments. Yours is the best-known argument I know of to the effect that it's more likely than you might think that we're living in a simulation. Maybe we'll have time to talk about that. The famous paperclip maximizing experiment that demonstrates that AI could get out of control more easily than you might imagine. That is most closely associated with you, I think. Your book, Superintelligence, which came out about 10 years ago, was very influential in tech circles. I mean, Elon Musk read it, praised it. Bill Gates did. Sam Altman, the year after it was published, I think it was published in 2014. Is that right? Superintelligence?
That's right.
Said it was the best book on AI he had ever read. Some people might say, in light of the last year or so of his career, that if that book is his guiding light, he's got a funny way of showing it, but I'll leave that aside for now. Maybe I'll have time to ask you that later. And your book is associated with doomerism of a kind of a sci-fi sort, the idea that the AI could actually take over the planet and our species might be in deep trouble in the long run. I mean, is that fair for starters?
Well, not really. I mean, yeah. So it is true that it's my position is sometimes being characterized as a doomer. I've been characterized as all kinds of different things, most of which I don't recognize myself in the descriptions. Now, regarding AI doom, I do think there will be big risks from the development of advanced AI, including existential risks that could lead to doom. I think that is among the possible outcomes, but it's far from the only one. And overall, I'm pretty, as it were, pro-AI. So my views are more complex than some people are prone to believe.
Yeah. I mean, I think strictly speaking, the book Superintelligence is just laying out possible pathways and trying to convince people that some of the less discussed pathways that could be problematic deserve more discussion. I don't think you come out explicitly assigning probabilities to various outcomes. The book does end on a quite cautionary note, I would say. There's like a metaphor of a child playing with a bomb. Comparison with our species encountering a true superintelligence, which we're not doing yet, of course. But
so the book came out in 2014. It was in the works for 6 years prior to that. At that time, it's important now, maybe hard to imagine, but at the time, this whole topic was completely ignored and neglected, certainly by academia. The very idea that you could develop AGI, artificial general intelligence, or superintelligence, that was just dismissed as science fiction. And then this notion that there could be big existential risks that we should start to be concerned about also completely outside the sort of intellectual Overton window at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt when I was writing the book that it was important to try to raise awareness of these issues and develop some of the conceptual tools that you need to start to actually work on these problems, to develop scalable methods for AI alignment. In the intervening years, of course, a lot of things have changed, and now it's like very, very mainstream to be impressed by the progress of AI, to take AGI seriously, and indeed to work on AI alignment. All the frontier AI labs now have research groups specifically
Mm-hmm.
trying to develop AI alignment techniques.
Okay.
So now, I think, I mean, for my part, rather than just harping on the same notes that people maybe have heard, I'm kind of interested in also exploring other sides of this complex issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when the book came out, the conversation about this was confined pretty much to a small circle of people, many of them who read the blog Less Wrong. And, even then, Eliezer Yudkowsky, who's maybe the most famous kind of sci-fi AI doomer, um, I actually had a conversation with him on the podcast back when it was called Blogging Heads TV, maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And I listened to it recently. And he was kind of in transition from having been an extreme AI optimist to becoming what he is today. Even he was not nearly as pessimistic in that general zone as he is now. Now, were you part of the conversation on Less Wrong and were you part of that circle?
Yeah. So it is true, even back then, there were like a small number of people, kind of some people on the internet who had been thinking about these things. Indeed, dating back already to like the 90s, there were various kind of chat groups and Eliezer was one of the very first people who sort of started paying attention to this prospect of superintelligence and the alignment challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I think in his very early year, he was kind of optimistic about that, but then kind of had an increasing level of pessimism about our ability to solve the alignment problem in time.
Yeah, well, he was certainly ahead of the curve on the pessimism. I don't mean to say he was a latecomer to that at all. I want to get back to all of this and superintelligent takeoff, but let's talk about the new book, Deep Utopia. Now, some people might look at it and say, okay, now you're exploring the implications of everything going well. Like imagine this dream world where we have harnessed AI to our ends and it's not threatening. And you're actually asking how great that really would necessarily be if all our needs were met by AI, which turns out to be a very interesting question. But some people might look at that and say, wait a second, you've really, you flipped on us. We were thinking of you as a hardcore doomer. Now suddenly you're taking utopia seriously. I assume you'd say people are misunderstanding one or both books if they think you've flipped.
Or misunderstood me. Yeah, I mean it seems so dumb. Like that, you just spend your whole life trying to like figure stuff out and develop complex structure, and then at the end of the day, people like distill that down to one bit of information, like pessimist or optimist.
Yeah.
And then what about all this structure that you try to figure? So yeah, I mean, obviously, both sides have always been there, and indeed in my work before superintelligence, I had various attempts also to outline what could become possible if we managed to overcome some of our current biological limitations. I had this little mini essay, a letter from Utopia, which is a sort of poetic attempt. It's written as if this future person is addressing their earlier self at the current age and are trying to encourage them to move forward to create this sort of post-human utopia where they have much longer and happier and healthier and brighter and better lives. But trying to make that vivid, and I, in other of my earlier writings as well. So it's in some sense the biggest reason for being concerned about the risks is that there is this enormous potential upside that we could realize if we avoid the risks. Like if the best you could possibly hope for is that things just continue on as they have, for the last several thousand years, and it just goes on like that with the same mix of misery and occasional glimpses. Like then, yeah, I mean, maybe you would still try to save the world, but you'd feel less urgency than if you thought we could actually make something much better than this. Because the current human condition, I mean, if you weigh it all up, right? Yeah, there are like kids smiling at you, but there is also factory farming, and there is also people with terminal cancer diagnosis, and there are cluster headaches, and there's a lot of things on the other side of the scale.
Plus, we seem to be on the brink of various kinds of horrible conflicts at the global level. So I think one way to set up the I mean, we're in some conflicts and on the brink of larger ones, I guess I'd say. So I think one way to set up discussion of the new book is by reference to a Twilight Zone episode I saw that I don't think is in the book. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. The story is this guy wakes up in the afterlife. I think he's been a gangster or something in real life, because I think he says, wow, I never dreamed I'd be in heaven. You know, how lucky. He has like a butler who I think is played by Sebastian Cabot, who is like his personal guide. It's like, what do you want? You know, what would you like? You know, some food, some drink, whatever. And the thing goes on, and turns out he can just have anything he wants. He can have the women he wants, anything. And eventually he gets kind of sick of all the easy gratification. And he says, you know, I just don't think this place is for me. And this was back in the late 50s, early 60s. You were not allowed to say the word hell on TV in America. He says, you know, I think I want to go to the other place. And Sebastian Cabot, final line of the show is, why, Mr. So-and-so, this is the other place. So in other words, you know, hell is having all your needs met. And this is the possibility you're exploring, that it might be harder than we imagine if all our needs were being met to be happy.
Well, yes, I know. I mean, that might be. I think like there are ways in which our needs would not be met that could be worse than our needs being met. So like, but yeah, it is true that if you sort of go through the list of plausible things we might want in our life in order to consider it a good life, there are some of those that it would be easy and trivial in this kind of technologically advanced utopian condition to satisfy. And then there are others that are more problematic, and one can kind of work one's way through the list. But if we start with the first one that might come to mind, is just, are you actually enjoying your time there? Like, are you feeling subjective well-being in all its forms, you know, physical and mental pleasure, like positive affect? And it sounded like from your description of this Twilight Zone that was missing in his life. Like after a while, he just got kind of fed up with the whole thing and felt like it wasn't very satisfying.
Yeah. I mean, let me say one more thing quickly. Don't forget whatever you're going to say, but the reason I use that example is you say in the book, I'm not imagining a utopia like the usually imagined utopias, right? Like they imagine that a lot of things stay the same, and I'm imagining a world where more things change, including a lot of needs being easy to meet that the traditional utopias might not see as being easy to meet. So that's why one reason I framed it, but.
So it's not, I mean, despite having the word utopia in the title, it's not normally utopias are sort of social blueprints for how to organize society to create like the perfectly fair society where everybody has enough and everything is organized and when they have people have tried to implement them, usually it's ended in tears, right? Like. But this book is not really at all focusing on sort of governance and politics and all of that. It more focuses on the philosophical question of value in human life. And in particular, if you remove a lot of the constraints that currently shape and limit what's possible for a human life to be like, you know, in this kind of technologically mature condition, then what would the ideal human life look like? Or the ideal continuation of Bob or Nick, if we could continue to be alive as this unfolded? Like, what would be perfect trajectory? look like. And then, yeah, we do get into some deep philosophical questions about what we ultimately value for its own sake. So you could either consider this whole sort of hypothetical of this, I call it a solved world. You could either just imagine that as a kind of thought experiment, like philosophers like to create thought experiments to sort of probe concepts and ideas. And then you would maybe imagine this more radical condition where we don't just have sort of plenty of food, but we have sort of almost unlimited technological power as a kind of particle accelerators, like physicists, smash elementary particles together at enormous energies that are very unusual in nature, but then these bits split apart and you can see what it's made of, the basic constituents of matter, and create models of that. And you then assume that the same principles apply, in ordinary matter. There are still like the same quarks and stuff. We just can't see them except under these extreme conditions. Similarly with human values, if you sort of smash them together under these extreme, unusual conditions in the thought experiment, you might see what the basic constituents are. So that would be one way of reading the book, as just a sort of philosophical thought experiment. But I think it also could be practically relevant if you are actually take seriously this idea that we might be approaching sort of superintelligence that could, place us in this situation in real life. Yeah. In which case, there's a greater sort of practical urgency, perhaps, also to figure out what we think about these matters.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly true that more and more of our needs are easy to meet if you assume a certain level of affluence, which of course isn't universally shared by any means. But and we may soon see a leap even in that if you kind of wed improving virtual reality technology with AI and you imagine these autonomous, convincing characters and so on. People could do a lot of things successfully in that world that you might have trouble doing that. What are, before we get into what parts of human nature pose the biggest challenges to being, to flourish in a world where tons of things are easy? Can you talk about some of the things that would be easy in this imagined world? I mean, what we hear most of is, well, you won't have to work and maybe we'll have universal income, but you're going well beyond that. What other things conceivably could AI change about what we do and don't have to do in life?
Yeah, so the traditional way maybe of imagining a utopian condition is just the vision of material plenty. So there was this medieval fantasy of the land of cocaine, which was basically rivers overflow with wine, roasted turkeys fall from the sky onto your plate. There's like a feasting and abundance. So it's easy, if you're a kind of starved medieval peasant, that already would be like a huge wish fulfillment, right? Just to have abundance of food and maybe some partying and loosening of the social mores. So that you could it might be in that that's level 1 utopia or something. There's plenty of stuff around. Then level 2, so that would be post scarcity. Then you could say one step more advanced than that is if you could also have post work. So not just are we very rich, but we don't have to work to make all the money. So you have robots maybe running around, growing the food and running the factories and driving the cars, etc. And we have both post scarcity and post work. That would be a more radical conception. Mm-hmm. But I think we can get a couple of levels beyond that. So it's not just that human economic labor that will become obsolete when AI fully succeeds, but a wide range of other instrumental efforts as well that we currently have to undertake. So even if you have enough money that you never need to work, a lot of the time you still need to exert yourself in various ways in order to achieve your goals. I mean, Bill Gates has to brush his teeth every morning. If he wants to get fit, he has to put in the hours at the treadmill. If you want to have a good relationship with other people, you have to spend time and talk to them and invest in various activities. So I think if you start to think through these kind of leisure activities that we might fill our lives with, if we had high level of universal basic income, like a lot of those can be crossed out. That might no longer make sense if the reason for doing them they didn't apply because a robot could do them all better. So then you'd have like a post-instrumental condition or something approximating it, where everything we do for the sake of something else would become pointless. And then I think there's like one level beyond that. I call it a plastic world, where we ourselves, our own human nature, our bodies and minds and psychological states become completely malleable. You basically have the ability to choose like what you experience at any time. So with sufficiently advanced technology, I think this would be an affordance. And so then
So what's an example of something that's easy by virtue of the plasticity? Or that
so one thing would be say if you want to be fit and strong, now you have to exercise.
you have to, okay.
But then you'd maybe just take a pill that would induce the same physiological effects in your body without spending an hour on the Stairmaster.
Yeah, I'm in favor of that. I want to go on record.
But maybe more importantly, our mental states. You would be able to, if you want to experience joy, you'd have sort of imagine the perfect drug without side effects and without addiction that just specifically induced the precise change in your psychological states that you wanted. Maybe you're not drugged out, just a pure elevation of your enjoyment of the moment, let's say. And so on for every possible mental state or mood or experience and skills as well.
Do you think it's still an open question as to whether that is in principle possible? In other words, addiction happens by virtue of the fact that what goes up must come down, so to speak. That pleasure inherently, comes with a time limit, and worse than that, that once it's gone, you tend to long for it. I mean, that's a common experience. Both with drugs and with things like status elevation. This is why, like so many like athletes after they retire get depressed, and even get depressed, 3 days after a great victory, and so on. Is it established that is fixable in principle, that it's not almost built into the metaphysics of the universe somehow,
well,
as opposed to be, yeah.
I think to at least a significant degree, I think we have existence proof. I have a friend of mine, a former colleague, who tells me that he's basically never bored, and I believe him because I've never seen him manifest the slightest sign. He's interested in everything except sport, but like every topic, he's just constantly cheerful and in good mood. And on the other side, of course, you have people who are like depressed all the time, and it's like if what comes up comes down, it doesn't seem like what comes down necessarily comes up. It does for some bounce back, right? But some can just live their whole life in a constant. So I don't think there's any metaphysical necessity that says that it has to somehow balance out. It's like dependent on brain architectures, and already within the human distribution, we see a pretty wide range. And there's no reason to think like that the human distribution exhausts the metaphysically possible distribution of mental lives that beings could experience.
Okay. So the fleetingness of gratification is not the big obstacle to, being enduringly happy and fulfilled in a world where all problems have been solved. In other words, science has gone as far as as it can go in terms of improving our welfare. AI is doing this and that, and so on.
So at this technological maturity, I think it is a big problem today, right? Where our kind of neural architecture, we have this hedonic treadmill, right? Like where our kind of expectation level. So it makes it really hard. You like have to put on this more and more elaborate show of like slightly better dramas and slightly more comfortable chairs, and little like all this effort goes into just to like wring another little drop of reward from our reward system, and then it recalibrates. So that ultimately would place a huge limit on how good it seems human life could be if we were forever confined to not actually working with what's inside the skull. If the only way we could affect what's inside the skull is through sort of our sensory organs, then I think that would be diminishing returns. And we are probably already a good distance up that diminishing returns curve. I mean, if without changing our internals, it might be that life now for people who live in reasonably affluent conditions is closer to the maximum than it is to sort of the hunter-gatherer existence. Like once you have enough to eat and warm shelter and a few other things, you might be more than halfway to sort of how materially good things could be for a human being.
Okay. And can you elaborate on what form changing the internals, as you put it, might take in kind of a specific way? Because we're not just talking about AI, although AI might be the thing that figured out the solutions we're talking about. But what kinds of interventions?
Well, I mean, so the sky is the limit there, and different people would have different values that would maybe permit more or less modification of their sort of status quo, and where the results still being that they would identify as themselves. But for a starter, I think just alleviating all the misery that exists now for people who are like chronically just miserable and can't really enjoy life because of they have too few dopamine receptors in some particular area. Like give them the option to fix that. For people who have like constant aches, fix those. And just like I think that already is like I think enough, just the opportunities to alleviate suffering to sort of make this very worthwhile. But I think there is like also the opportunity to lift the ceiling up. And where you could imagine, maybe the easiest is just emotional well-being. We started with this. It's kind of the simplest and most obvious value. Like what's the point of the whole future if you actually don't enjoy it while you're there? Like if it's actually miserable, then it doesn't. That alone seems like super important. If a future that just goes on and no people in it don't really enjoy it, like that seems kind of way worse than a future where people are having a great time. So there, I think, you could definitely enable people to experience more well-being, subjective well-being, and that would be one of these boxes that I think we would trivially be able to check in this postulated condition of technological maturity.
So that's in a way getting a lot of people who have particular problems more to like where I am.
Well,
so to speak.
but then maybe you could be
exactly. That was going to be my next point.
Kind of at the peak constantly. I mean, you can distinguish within your own life. Probably there are like better times and worse times. So why not make more of the time?
That's what I mean. Like, what are the? How do you change the internals once you get up to because my internals could use changing. Believe me. In other words, I mean, it gets back to this. Like, people would like to be happy forever. It has always seemed to me, again, that I am not yet convinced that's possible. Although I've talked to people, I talked to a guy named Gary Weber, who I'm convinced, he's a hardcore meditator and everything. And when he says, "I feel as if there's nothing you could change that would make me happier," I trust him. So I guess it's true. But anyway, what kind of intervention would get me to where he is, aside from meditating like 5 hours a day?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a little pill you pop, or maybe some gene editing thing that rewires some things in your brain, or presumably that would be even more sophisticated technologies that would give you direct access to the neuronal matrix, maybe with some nanotech bots. I mean, I think it's also this is like a separate claim, but like maybe people would upload into computers and our minds would be digital, which would make these kinds of editing operations a lot easier. But I think a lot could be possible even if we remain biological. Maybe you couldn't literally at every moment choose exactly your psychological state in every respect, but something approximating that just by looking at what's already crudely possible with different drugs and different personalities and natural temperaments and all of that, and then presumably a bunch more.
Okay. But there are, well, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Bob.
I was going to say, I gather there are, in your view, just particular challenges to being enduringly gratified. I mean, for example, meaning is in the subtitle of your book, and you talk about purpose. And when we think of a pill that just makes me happy all the time, I'm not sure we think that I would have to have a sense of purpose, or even that life would have to have meaning, beyond my feeling good. Uh,
Right.
but what, why are you spending so much time on meaning and purpose? I guess is
Because
the question.
there is where it gets more problematic and non-obvious to what extent these utopians could still have meaning and purpose and significance. So there are a couple of other values that would be relatively obvious that we could sort of add to the list. So if we take pleasure first, as like we kind of covered that with this brain technology, you could kind of choose mental states. So you wouldn't have to get eventually disappointed and bored, that like psychologically you would have this control. Another is, instead of just imagining like these people then as kind of junkies sprawled out on a mattress, like blissed out, but not doing, you could imagine the pleasure more coupled to experiences. So kind of perceptions of great beauty or deep truths, that they could take pleasure in actually having these complex, sophisticated experiences that track aesthetic value or truth or goodness. That already sort of expands the set of values that would count this kind of future as good. So now it's both like scores high on the hedonic dimension, right? Plus it also has, for people who think that beauty and like understanding and appreciation of goodness, it adds value to a life. It's kind of possible. Then you could have a lot of that as well, because there's no reason why they would just have to stare into a wall when they're feeling happy. Like why not appreciate great works of music and opera, or the beauty of nature, or the goodness that we find in various acts in history and so forth. So we could put a check mark there as well on the sort of aesthetic dimension, if you want, or the experience texture. Then you might wonder, well, already this kind of so far sounds very passive, like you're sitting there kind of in a chair experiencing beauty and staring at beautiful things. Like maybe that's better than just having the pleasure, but still something is missing. So what about activity? Well, the reason for why these utopians couldn't be active and pursue various activities, and this connects to, like, we're starting now to get into purpose. Like, why would you do this? So one thing that would certainly be possible is artificial purpose. So these would be goals that you adopt basically just for the sake of having a goal. And then once you have the goal, you might then pursue and exert yourself in pursuit of it, and it enables an activity. So we do that now. We play games, right? You adopt the arbitrary goal of getting the little golf ball in a sequence of holes, using only the very inconvenient method of hitting it with a club.
Do you play golf, by the way?
No.
Okay.
Maybe I should take that up at some point when I have more time. But I've it is something you could decide to try to do, to get the ball in these sequence of holes. For whatever reason, let's suppose you do adopt that goal. Then after you have adopted that goal, now the only way you can achieve it is by going out on the golf court and trying to look carefully at the slope of the field and putting effort into it. And then you have this experience of playing golf. And similarly with a lot of other things that we do, right? We sort of set ourselves goals and try to achieve them. And in that activity that is enabled, we sometimes find value and psychological satisfaction. So artificial goals would be possible. And indeed, some people might find it hard to motivate themselves, but in this condition, right, with plasticity, you could, if you wanted to, sort of instill these goals and make yourself super motivated to pursue them. So now we have pleasure, we have experience texture, and we have artificial purpose that enables these various activities. So you could have these active people, they spend their time playing games and having great fun, and it's very beautiful, and they appreciate, understand deep truths of mathematics, which give them great joy. They relate to one another in deep ways that give them enormous satisfaction. And it already seems pretty good, I think. You might still think that there's like something missing though, which is like true purpose. Like, yeah, they have these goals they set themselves, but you don't really need, like, there's no objective need for anybody to do the golf playing or all of these little goals they set themselves. Like, it doesn't ultimately accomplish anything.
But isn't the premise of your exploration that there's no real need to do anything?
Right. And the question then is, does that mean that the lives of these people are deficient in some way? That there's some value that we have that they would lack in their lives? Like, one thing that you might think adds value to human life, aside from how happy it makes you feel and stuff, if you can actually make a real contribution to the world, I mean, it might be good for the world, but you might also think it's actually make your life better, that it contained this episode of you accomplishing something that contributed. So now, if you are in this solved world where all problems might already be solved, there's like no, poverty to like help the poor, or cure the sick, or to like, so B, if there are problems remaining, they would anyway be better dealt with by the AIs and the robots, and your efforts wouldn't help. Then in that situation, there is like one type of contribution that seems unavailable to you, and you couldn't have that value in your life of making a sort of substantive contribution to other people of the world, or at least that's how it might seem.
Because there, in a certain sense, are no needs. It isn't just that. Yeah, I mean, no one else has any needs that you could help them fill.
That would be the worry, at least, or that so therefore the utopians' lives might be good in many respects, but they would be deficient in this sense of having real purpose, and maybe that would make their lives slightly worse than it would if it had all these other things plus real purpose. You might still think, like, given that it has so much of these other values, that might compensate for being a little bit kind of frivolous, and that's possible. But you might also be interested in saying, well, is there could we at least get some real purpose in there? Like, is it like completely unavailable? And I think there might be ways in which they could get at least sort of like weaker purposes. So yeah, like maybe there is no great like natural catastrophe that they could prevent and save the world, that like strongest sense of purpose. But then again, most people don't really have that in their lives today, right? And most people are not saving the world or curing cancer, or like, so we have to be a little bit realistic here about where we set the expectation level. If you take a hard, cool look at most people's lives, it doesn't really sort of on a global scale make a huge difference. So we have to sort of scale down our ambition. Now, it is true that on a small scale, many people have the ability to have real purpose. There might at least be some other people they can make slightly happier. Maybe they can take good care of their kids, or when their spouse is sick, or their elderly parents they can visit. So like, do something good for the local community. So would that be something analogous? I think that there is at least in principle possibility. So suppose you have person A and person B, okay? Person A happens to want that person B gets what they want. This is just like a desire that A happens to have. They care about B's preferences, and all right. So, and then now B has the opportunity to give A the gift of purpose. If B decides to want that A does something for B, or accomplishes something like on their own steam, if that's what B happens to want, so they could design them, like, tweak themselves to they could make modify their own goals so that they now want that A does this thing. Then A now has a real purpose in that there is something that A wants to achieve, namely that B gets what they want, that can only be achieved by A actually exerting themselves.
So wait, so B would sacrifice surrender some of their prior assurance of happiness, introduce some genuine uncertainty into the equation. Like in the extreme case, I may fall off this cliff. Really, I may. I'm teetering on the edge. Come help me. Of course, that's an extreme case. But is this inherent in that B, who previously could have been guaranteed happiness, has to introduce some uncertainty into that voluntarily?
Well, If what A cares about is B's happiness, then then the happiness would have to be staked. But maybe A cares not just about B's happiness, but about B getting what they want. Like if B really has this, I mean, we do that now. Like somebody like really has been wanting this thing for their birthday. You might not think it will really make them happier, but the fact that they really want it, maybe you still feel that gives you a reason to try to get them that thing. And so analogous here, you could have this situation. Now, it's a little bit artificial in this simplified version with A and B that is a bit silly, but I think there could be subtler versions of basically the same phenomenon. Than where what we care about is what other people want, or what we might care about honoring certain traditions that essentially involve humans doing various things. And so, like creating a bunch of robots that perform the ceremonies and the rituals might not count as continuing the tradition. And then if we happen, for whatever reason, to care about these traditions, then that might give us reasons, real purposes to do these various things to achieve what we want. It's not a new goal that we would just adopt for the sake of having a goal, but some of our current existing goals might sort of call for continued effort and exertion and investment of time on our part.
Okay. When you refer to the texture of experience, like, so there's a difference between appreciating fine art and stuffing 3 powdered sugar donuts into your mouth. There are all these, and I guess there's this John Stuart Mill quote. They ask him, like, aren't you reducing everything to kind of crude happiness? And he says, I think he says, I'd rather be Socrates unsatisfied than a pig satisfied. So he's saying there are qualitative differences between different kinds of gratification. Is that largely what you're saying there when you get into the issue of texture?
Yeah. So many people have that view that pleasure is not the only thing that matters. But for example, then I'm making the point that in this postulated condition of technological maturity or in a solved world, you could also have not just the pleasure, but you could have whatever the pleasure coming from philosophical conversations, if that's what like Mill thinks, or from reading great poetry, or like having deep, meaningful conversations with other people, or whatever it is that you think is better than just raw like pig, like satisfied pig pleasure. You could add that. And you have to sort of go a bit further out before you reach these questions where it become like less obvious that the utopians could just have a lot more of it than we do. And I was suggesting that even when we do get quite far out to like the purpose, which does present more of a challenge, A, they could have artificial purpose, but B, I also suggested they could have these forms of natural purpose that were of this form where we sort of care about traditions or care about what other people think. Now, you might say that, maybe we care a little bit about upholding traditions, but it's like a weak form of purpose. It's not like life or death survival like we currently have. Like if people have purpose now, they need to work or they get kicked out of their flat, right? They need to do all these kind of things, and it has real consequences. It's just, whereas like this kind of upholding this tradition where we used to do things ourselves, we keep doing them for the sake of honoring the tradition. It's like a weaker form of purpose. And yeah, that is true, but it might be appropriate that these considerations that currently have less weight for us, because there are more important things to do. Like once the more important things don't need to be done anymore, maybe we should sort of up calibrate the things that remain. So there might be all these kind of I call them kind of like canopy value, or like if you imagine like weaker, fainter values that might be out there, that we are currently oblivious to because we are sort of during the daylight, it's like the sun shining with its stark imperatives. You have to do this, you have to do this.
Right.
You have to go to bed now, otherwise we'll be totally tired tomorrow. You have to go to work, otherwise you'll get fired from your job. You have to pick up the kids from school because otherwise like this. We are so... but if you did managing to remove all of that, it would be a little bit like, I think, walking out at nighttime, and then you should allow your pupils to dilate, to sort of take in more of the light. And then you see that all along, there were all these constellations, all these other subtler values. And they were always there. It's just we couldn't see them because of the sort of screaming moral imperatives that occupied our attention.
Right. I mean, like, I am pretty absorbed in work, and when my kids were at home, they took a certain amount of time, maybe not as much as they would have liked. But on the rare cases when I have time to do anything remotely like gardening, and anybody who looks at my yard knows that no true gardening ever gets done, but, kind of minimal yard upkeep, like going out and making something a little better, it actually feels very good. And it's so good that if I had the option of having a robot do it, I might decide not to. Um, and so there's probably a lot of stuff like that out there. I mean, the reason I asked you about golf is because while I was reading your book, I started thinking, just when imagining not having to work, I thought, all my life I've thought, if I had the chance to go play golf several times a week, I think I could get a lot better. It would be fun. And golf can be fun, partly because it's a social game. You go out with people and you talk while you're playing and stuff. I can imagine all that stuff uh, being pretty gratifying. It's just hard to say since you don't have time to do that. Whether it would get old. Let me ask you how soon you think a certain form of this kind of challenge is going to be presented by something I alluded to earlier, which is the kind of marriage of increasingly sophisticated virtual reality and AI. I mean, in the, like in the Twilight Zone I referred to, one reason the guy got bored is because everything was too easy. But especially with the introduction of AI-driven characters in virtual reality, there can be a tremendous amount of challenge and uncertainty as much as you want or don't want. Um, do you do you think about that world much? Is it? Do you think it's just around the corner that there's going to be a pretty big change in our ability to immerse ourselves in things that seem like the real world? And that's good.
Yeah, well, I think in particular, the sort of social companion bots of different varieties, from just kind of artificial AI friends to kind of more not safe for work application. I think that seems like an area where I'd imagine the next couple of years there will be like major strides forward, probably become like a big social topic of controversy, to what extent it's good or not that people have these kind of fake friends or artificial substitutes, and probably the old generation will bemoan this and say it's much better that you should have real friends, be with real humans. And then maybe the generation growing up with this will think, oh, you old guys don't get it, like this is a lot more interesting, they're a lot wittier and listen better, and it's really good. And so it can be hard to have opinions about those things that don't merely reflect one's own personality and upbringing culture. Like to actually, everybody will have opinions about these things, but to actually make one's opinions kind of reflect some deeper underlying realities is quite hard. But I do think that it is really hard when trying to make these value judgments about these hypothetical futures, to not have those value judgments be shaped by what one actually thinks one would oneself take enjoyment in. To sort of truly factor out this component of hedonic satisfaction. Like people who think golf is a valuable activity to be done in Utopia are probably the people who right now actually find it fun to play golf. And people who find it boring to play golf wouldn't imagine it to be a valuable utopian activity. But you really have to then imagine that you could sort of adjust the enjoyment level separately from the activity if you want to sort of, and I think that already presents a big obstacle for like thinking clearly about these issues. That to a large extent, like what we say is like a good way to spend human life will reflect our own subjective experiences of how much subjective satisfaction we get when we engage in those activities ourselves.
Okay, so how optimistic do you wind up being about the ability of our species to flourish and find meaning and purpose and happiness in a so-called solved world that you imagine? And that's if everything goes well and we don't blow up the world or surrender it to tyrannical AIs.
Yeah, I mean, I think the future could then be literally beyond our wildest imaginings. That is, it could be better than we are even physiologically capable of imagining with our current brains. There is a huge space of possible modes of beings. And we have only explored a tiny little corner. And I think we would be very naive to feel confident in our ability to judge this much larger space. Just as a little mouse or a cat or something has little inclination of all the things that we think give human lives meaning. Humor and literature and romantic love and all these other things, art, and so I think there are like other layers and forms of value that could become accessible to us if we unlock this future, but that we are currently sort of deaf, dumb, and blind to.
Okay, well, so as you know, what I generally do with these podcasts is the first hour or so is public, which this has been, and then the rest, we're going to continue the conversation, but the rest is available to Nonzero newsletter members. You can become one of those by going to the Nonzero newsletter and becoming a paid subscriber. And there you'll find, first of all, the post containing the full conversation, but also a way to create a podcast feed that from now on will always have these overtime portions of the podcast. Before we move into overtime, Nick, I wanted to, well, first of all, repeat that the book is called Deep Utopia, Life and Meaning in a Solved World. And, it's both an exploration of possible futures and a kind of thought experiment that permits kind of rich reflection on human nature and the sources of meaning and purpose. So it's kind of got two tracks. Is there anything else you want to say about it or other work, or where people can find your other work?
Well, yeah. So, on the book, yeah. So it's like it's also a bunch of other things. It's like a kind of satire of academia, and it's like a bunch of other things too.
Well, we should say it has an unusual form where there's kind of we'll leave it. It has a little bit of a Socratic dialogue vibe, but go ahead.
Yoder the fox and Pignolius the pig and a bunch of others. But yeah, it's probably a book that requires some effort to be put into it by the reader. So I think you sort of get out from like in proportion to what you put in. But yeah, no, I'm Googleable. My other works, I have a homepage. You put in Nick Bostrom. You can find nickbostrom.com. A lot of my papers and stuff.
Yeah. And by the way, one thing I came across there is your paper on the singleton from, I don't know, maybe close to 20 years ago. And I was gratified to see that my book Nonzero was cited in that. All the more so because the idea of the singleton is going to play a role in a book I'm writing about AI. And I want to talk to you about that in the overtime segment, and also get into the superintelligence thing a little more. Get back to the question of how likely we are to get to utopia in the first place, in a way. So thanks everybody who's stayed with us this far. Hope you'll follow us into overtime, and that's where we are going now.